Russia. A country whose name ignites some, interesting reactions and opinions, each and every one stronger and more passionate than the last. And understandably so. Since over the course of about 3 years and due to recent geopolitical events, Russia's reputation and cultural footprint has gone through a total makeover, changing from that funny suka bliat country full of wacky Counter-Strike loving, Adidas wearing and vodka drinking gopniks to evil energetic empire imperialist boogeyman and the scum of the earth. Or maybe you're part of the crowd that views them as saviors of tradition and Christianity and a technological utopia that's 20 years ahead of us Western degenerates. I mean, those shopping cart escalators sure are innovative and one of a kind, not gonna lie. Basically, the negative reputation of Putin's authoritarian government has pretty much overshadowed any goodwill or remorse one could feel about the Russian people themselves. And while this cultural shift has happened overnight in Western countries like France and Germany, there are many Eastern European ones that had been well aware of Russia's shenanigans and remained skeptical of the country until the very end, such as none other than Poland. The Polish-Russian rivalry is one of the oldest and most intense in human history, with a long history spanning centuries and ages. Whether we're talking about small regional kingdoms or continental powerhouses, the Russians and Poles were always caught in an endless state of conflict, battling in landscapes ranging from the cold East European plains to the mindscapes of diplomacy, as well as the limitless world of public forums and counter-strike lobbies. But why is that? Well, to understand why Poland and Russia hate each other, we'll have to go far back into the past. So strap in, folks, get some pierogi or pelmeni to eat, because today we'll examine the history of one of the longest lasting and most intense blood feuds in history, Poland versus Russia. The Polish-Russian rivalry is long and eventful, with its origin beginning about 1,000 years ago in the medieval ages. In fact, the first documented conflict between the two factions was Vladimir the Great of Kievan Rus's military campaign in the late 10th century against the first ever Duchy of Poland, ruled by its founder Mieszko I. Over the centuries, the Polish kingdom beefed with the Russians and their ancestors in all of their iterations, such as with the Kievan Rus, Ruthenia, the Principality of Moscow, and even the Golden Horde. Most of the early conflict between the two was nothing out of the ordinary for two bordering medieval states at the time. Their quarrels were manifested in the usual medieval shenanigans via small-scale skirmishes, which evolved into huge battles, political alliances, and marriages between noble houses, and subsequent backstabbings between said nobles. So, let's not dwell on this part of history for too long and just skip to the juicier stuff, starting with the 17th century, the last years of the Polish Golden Age. Having achieved its greatest territorial expansion, the imposing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was truly one of Europe's most fearsome powers, both a multicultural bastion with a prosperous economy, as well as a military powerhouse, with the elite winged hussars being a force to be reckoned with. The Commonwealth even tried their luck in buying some colonies in Africa and the Caribbean, as all great European powers do. They failed, obviously, but it's the thought that counts. However, like always, trouble came a-knockin' on the eastern border in the form of the Tsardom of Russia, or Muscovy. At first, the two powers were evenly matched, and constantly traded blows with one another. Hell, the Commonwealth even managed to completely occupy Moscow for 2 whole years. And so, for many years, this remained the status quo, Slavs killing Slavs. Yet, this delicate balance of powers took a turn for the worse in the mid-17th century. Freshly reconsolidated after the time of troubles, Russia enjoyed a steady rise, while at the same time the Commonwealth's years of glory and supremacy were far behind them. As such, when the Russo-Polish War, or the 13 Years' War, started, in spite of fierce resistance from the Poles, the Russians firmly kicked their asses. To be fair, you couldn't really call it a fair fight since the Commonwealth was surrounded and attacked on all sides, with other influential powers ganging up on them with simultaneous campaigns such as the Swedes and their deluge. The Polish defeat opened the floodgates of Russian supremacy, evolving the country from a regional Tsardom to an intercontinental empire and being virtually unmatched as the leading political and cultural power in northeastern Europe. At the same time, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was struggling to rebuild its settlements, as well as its prestige, following the intense battles with its neighbors. Couple that with the constant arguing between members of the Polish nobility, or the Szlachta as they were called, and you could tell that the Poles were not doing so great. But hey, at least they were immortalized for being the decisive force in the legendary Battle of Vienna in 1683, sundering the Ottoman threat once and for all. However, while this was a great Polish moment in history, the momentum was on the side of their rival neighboring empires. Caught in the crosshairs of the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian empires, and their thirst for absolute power, the Commonwealth kept bleeding through an agonizingly long and perpetual decline and remained a great power only in name and land size alone. And with such fertile land perfectly suited for agriculture as well as rich reserves of valuable minerals, it's like the Poles were begging to be invaded and exploited by its superior neighbors. Seeing how far the Commonwealth had fallen and smelling blood in the water, the three empires mutually agreed that bullying it and weakening its influence was the right call, nay, a moral obligation. Together, they started destabilizing it through various methods, before delivering the three Polish partition combo on them. For an abridged version of what happened, the partition negotiations began with one empire going like this. Hi, we are going to expand and take Polish-Lithuanian lands. How preposterous! This will upset the balance of power and bring chaos upon the European continent. We must also invade Polish-Lithuanian territory to ensure stability and save Europe. Alright, wanna do it together? The Poles found themselves in an unenviable lose-lose situation, as they could either comply with the three large empires' demands, or fight back and suffer the consequences. Not that they could act quickly or decisively, since they were deep into Russian pockets following the coronation of Stanislav II as King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, with the support of Russian Empress and certified girl boss Catherine the Great. Despite still enjoying an independent status from the Tsarina, Stanislav was forced to juggle between the demands of the Szlachta and his Russian ally, and he struggled to fully reform the Commonwealth and restore its former glory. This task was made near impossible due to the Commonwealth still using the Liberian veto system, in which any and every member of the Polish parliament had the power to nullify any legislative proposal if they so desired. Surely, this veto system was such a flawless tool that allowed for laws and reforms to be easily passed and was completely bulletproof against personal or even outside interests of foreign powers praying for their downfall. The writing was on the wall, and so, little by little, partition by partition, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was no more.
Change the world. My final message. Goodbye.
But worry not, folks, cause here comes Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, Grand Strategist, and Master of Europe. He may be vertically challenged, allegedly, but in the battlegrounds he's totally unmatched. Here he comes, decimating the Central Powers, liberating the Poles from their clutches, and establishing the Duchy of Warsaw under the direct protection of the French Emperor. Now, they can rest and prepare for their next... What? Wait, wait? Napoleon? What are you doing? No, you can't be serious, don't do it! Napoleon, don't try to invade Russia! God damn it, no! Napoleon, how could you make such a blunder? You were the chosen one! Poland was supposed to be free! Perhaps Russian war tactics were superior. Perhaps their numbers were better. Perhaps their weapons finer. Perhaps if you had NordVPN, you could have won! No! What was the biggest downside of living in the medieval ages? Not having proper sanitation, dying before turning 30, child labor, being essentially enslaved to your landlord? Ha! Not being able to use NordVPN and secure your data while watching your favorite shows not available in your region? I think we all know the answer. Unlike other VPNs that just change where you're browsing from, Nord goes the extra mile and protects you from malware, phishing, scams, and other threats that cyber criminals might throw at you by blocking fake and malicious websites and pop-ups. In addition to that, Nord also stops dumb web trackers and protects your privacy. Best part of all, it doesn't even need a VPN connection to work. That's how good Nord is. While browsing, Nord also monitors the web for your data and alerts you immediately if it detects a leak. So with Nord, you can easily browse the web at your favorite cafe with a sense of security and procrastinate like a pro, watching region-locked shows and movies. So don't waste any time and go to my link in the description at nordvpn.com/ironicallyvpn and get your exclusive NordVPN deal plus 4 months extra with a 30-day money-back guarantee. After the end of this Napoleonic episode, the great European powers mutually agreed to once again maintain peace and stability above all else on the continent, in what was called the Concert of Europe. This meant that the Duchy of Warsaw was to be disbanded immediately and incorporated into the Russian Empire, and there was absolutely no chance in hell that a Polish state could re-emerge during these peaceful and prosperous times and upset the delicate balance of power. So they would remain chopped off by larger empires until the foreseeable future. But how bad did the Poles have it under foreign rule? Well, the Habsburgs were generally chill to the Poles, and as a nice act of kindness, Krakow got to be its little free city-state with a flourishing university for some time at least. Then there was the Prussian Empire, which tried to assimilate the Poles pretty aggressively through lots and lots of Germanization methods, such as bringing in hundreds of thousands of German colonists or imposing limitations of the Polish language in public spaces and institutions. Generally, typical German colonial stuff. But both Austrian and Prussian reigns pale in comparison to the way the Poles were subjugated and oppressed by the Russians. Even though the Tsar allowed in the beginning for the existence of a semi-autonomous kingdom of Poland with separate armies, institutions, and citizenship, this entity functioned more or less like a Russian puppet state, with no degree of self-determination, a far cry from the ideals of an independent Poland, and even those small liberties would be taken away little by little. Throughout the 19th century, the Kingdom of Poland was subjected to increasingly more autocratic subjugation from the Russian Empire, clear violations of its constitution up until it was thrown away in 1832, as well as countless attempts at the Russification of the Polish people and society through measures of cultural, religious, educational, and linguistic suppression and censorship. The peasants, just like in most Russian-controlled lands, were either taxed to oblivion or forced into serfdom, basically becoming slaves to a patch of land instead of a person or legal entity. These attempts at Russifying the Polish people got increasingly worse and more extreme with each revolt and fight for independence. As when the Poles would rise up, the Russians would double down to suppress them, which would just instigate another revolt, becoming essentially a vicious cycle of oppression and revolution between the two. Of course, it comes as a surprise to absolutely no one that the Poles deeply resented being told around and subjugated by the Russians, so they constantly expressed their disdain and dissatisfaction by organizing protests, uprisings, and even assassination attempts in order to liberate themselves, which continually degraded the relationship between the two. The first notable insurrection against Russian authority was the November Uprising of 1830, a messy affair which started with Polish insurgents attempting to assassinate the Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich, the ruler of the Kingdom of Poland appointed by Tsar Nicholas I, who was his brother. Although the assassination plot failed, the Polish revolutionaries managed to seize enough weaponry to arm themselves and capture parts of Warsaw. While the uprising gained widespread support throughout Poland, as well as Russian-controlled modern-day Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, the rebels were simply too disorganized, inexperienced, and reckless, and were instantly rolled over once Tsar Nicholas rallied his army of over 100,000 troops and regained control over Poland. Following the failed November uprising, the Poles were punished severely. Thousands of rebels were either killed or exiled to Siberia, while the Polish kingdom's constitution was discarded and its army was incorporated into the Russian army. Speaking of which, later on in the 1860s, hoping to weaken Polish patriotism and resistance against Russification, Russia announced its desire to draft young Polish men into its army. The young conscripts, in response, secretly fled into the woodlands and issued a manifesto calling for a national insurrection. This marked the beginning of the 1863 January Uprising, the longest-lasting insurgency in Russian-controlled Poland, which unfolded through countless peasant revolts, battles, and skirmishes in what was effectively a guerrilla war waged against the empire. Unfortunately, just like the November Uprising, the underprepared and underexperienced rebels lost their support from the Polish peasants and were eventually squashed by the Russian militia, and again persecuted, killed, or sent to Siberia. For the remainder of the 19th century, there were no other insurrections of this scale or magnitude waged by the Poles. However, on January 22nd, 1905, an opportunity arose when the Russian imperial forces opened fire on thousands of peaceful unarmed demonstrators led by Father Georgy Gapon. This massacre, known as Bloody Sunday, would throw the entire Russian Empire into chaos and revolt and mark the beginning of the First Russian Revolution. Incidentally, the revolutionary flame also managed to spread in the Kingdom of Poland, where hundreds of thousands of workers went on strike, culminating in the Łódź insurrection in June of 1905, where the Polish insurgents violently clashed with the Tsarist troops. Unfortunately, this uprising was, you guessed it, ultimately crushed by the Russian authorities, along with similar manifestations throughout Poland and the entire First Russian Revolution itself. All of these attempts of Russifying the Polish population failed tremendously and actually had an adverse effect, as the Poles retaliated along with revolts a full-on cultural and artistic renaissance, also harboring ideas of individualism and nationalism which were unlike the liberal, progressive, and multicultural Commonwealth came to be. Perhaps this long and dreadful period in Poland's long history was the moment the idea of Polish sovereignty and individualism, as well as deep hatred for the Russians, were written and embedded in their DNA. Realizing that brute force and fiery uprisings wouldn't get them anywhere, the Poles who fled westwards and obtained influential positions in other empires like France and Great Britain started voicing their trials and tribulations and spreading the word of the Polish dream throughout Europe, hoping to gain the sympathy of the greater Allied powers and make them join their cause. And as luck would have it, the dream was getting closer to becoming a reality, since the balance of power that European empires were dearly holding on to was nothing more than a continental powder keg, filled up with imperial frustrations and ready to burst with a single spark. And that spark came from the gun wielded by Bosnian Serb Gavrilo Princip when he shot the Austrian Archduke. Look, you know the drill already. European empires declared war on one another like domino pieces, launching the First World War. A significant part of World War I saw the Polish lands being ravaged and bombarded as battles between the Russian Empire and the allied German Austro-Hungarian forces intensified. Thankfully, through the power of the indomitable Polish spirit as well as clever political maneuvering, the end of World War I brought with it the creation of the Second Polish Republic. It also helped a lot that the Germans were preparing to turn the lands they captured from the Russians into a buffer puppet state, so half of the work of establishing a new Polish state had already been done. Meanwhile, back in St. Petersburg, the Russian Empire and the Romanov dynasty collapsed, being replaced by the Soviet Bolsheviks. Hoping to spread the revolutionary ideas of communism by force, the Red Army started a westward offensive to occupy the Baltic lands abandoned by the Germans. This offensive culminated in the Polish-Soviet War. At first, the Poles successfully pushed the Soviets as far back as Vilnius and Kiev, but found themselves stretched too far and were quickly overwhelmed by General Stalin's armies all the way to Warsaw. In the end, the Polish army led by Józef Klemens Piłsudski mustered a heroic last stand to turn the tides and kick the Red Army out of Poland. This battle, aptly dubbed the Miracle on the Vistula, is nowadays considered one of the greatest military achievements in Polish history, and it couldn't have happened against a more fitting opponent. The following decades were filled with both prosperous and uncertain moments for the Second Polish Republic. What was definitely consistent, however, was the Soviets' hatred for the existence of this illegitimate state, as they would put it, as the Russians saw the Poles as traitors. Ironically, it just so happens that one of Poland's neighbors and former Russian enemy was thinking the exact same thing. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed by the ministers of foreign affairs from the Soviet Union and the Third German Reich, spelled absolute disaster for the Poles, as the two great powers of Germany and the USSR decided to divide Eastern Europe amongst themselves. Thus, on September 1st, 1939, the German army swept through the Polish countryside, with the Soviets fulfilling their contractual obligation and attacking them as well 2 weeks later, absolutely obliterating Polish resistance and once more partitioning the country, wiping it off the map. This double invasion happened in spite of Poland and both aggressors having signed non-aggression pacts that were supposed to be effective until 1944 and 1945. Poland being crushed was turned into a sandbox where the cruelest and most depraved war crimes and experiments were committed by both German and Russian hands. Nazi Germany's horrific atrocities in Poland, which included but were not limited to mass deportations, enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and genocide of both Poles and Jews alike, are all very well documented and discussed. However, the crimes committed by the Soviets on their side of annexed Poland must also be acknowledged. We can't talk about reasons why Poland hates Russia without mentioning the Katyn massacre, in which the Soviet secret police rounded up 22,000 Polish soldiers, officers, and prisoners of war, executed them, and buried their bodies in the forest next to the village of Katyn. Other than that, over 240,000 Polish soldiers were taken prisoners during Soviet occupation, with most of them being sent to labor camps and gulags, abused or outright murdered senselessly. Around 1 million Poles were displaced all over Soviet lands, from Ukraine to Kazakhstan and Siberia, and forced to live in inhumane conditions and work tirelessly in Soviet labor camps, not to mention the many cases of ransacking, demolition, abuse, rape, and senseless destruction committed by the Soviets. Through thick and thin, the unshakable Poles battled subjugation and extermination, and in the end, Polish bravery and resilience was rewarded fairly and justly by being placed back into the Russian sphere of influence after the Second Great War was concluded. Despite the horrendous crimes against humanity inflicted on the Poles by the Soviet troops, the Soviets were barely punished for their transgressions, unlike the Germans. After World War II, Poland's borders shifted left, gaining a large chunk of formerly German territory but ceding huge pieces of land in expense to Soviet republics like Ukraine and Belarus. The country was left in ruin, and efforts of reconstruction were very difficult as well as extremely costly. Poland could have especially benefited from joining the Marshall Plan, which was offered to them by the United States as well as to the rest of Eastern Europe, which would have put it back into shape like the other Western countries. However, Stalin rejected the plan on behalf of the rest of his satellite socialist republics, believing that they would turn against him. Stalin went, "We have a Marshall Plan at home," and created his own reconstruction program called the Molotov Plan to counteract those pesky Americans. This reconstruction effort was made even harder to manage after the expulsion of millions of Germans out of formerly German territories, coupled with similar relocation of Ukrainian Jewish residents. These expulsions, along with the deportation of around 1 million Poles from Western Soviet republics or Kresy, formerly Polish lands, which were annexed during World War II, resulted in the near homogeneous Polish state we know today. The Russian government, like in the rest of Eastern Europe, established puppet communist governments at the head of the Polish government, which was carefully overseen by the Soviet authorities, with the goal in mind that the Polish communist regime loyally obeyed and followed the Stalinist blueprint, joining the Warsaw Pact, it's their capital, go figure, and deepening military alliances with the USSR, falsifying free and democratic elections, adopting policies of collectivization and nationalization of industries and production, electing trustworthy and reliable people sent by the Kremlin in the right places, as well as brutally crushing any rebellion or uprisings, such as the 1956 workers' strike in Poznan. Stalin's death might have brought a general relaxation of authoritarian measures, however, Poland was still to follow the Soviet line at all times, such as their involvement in invading Czechoslovakia for being too rebellious. More crucially, the Polish economy wasn't growing as expected, so the people kept revolting. Each and every manifestation was also brutally suppressed, but one movement proved to be far more difficult to subdue. The shipyard strike carried out in Polish port cities like Gdansk, Gdynia, and Szczecin, led by an electrician named Lech Wałęsa, evolved into the Solidarity Independent Trade Union, which numbered over 10 million members during its first year. The Polish socialist government could not simply ignore this colossal movement, and in spite of numerous attempts to undergo negotiations or simply crush the movement by force, Polish solidarity simply refused to die. In the end, through diplomatic means, and thanks to Mikhail Gorbachev's refusal to intervene in other socialist republics' internal affairs, communism in Poland came to a peaceful end, unlike in other socialist republics. Romania. As soon as communism fell throughout Eastern Europe, along with the Iron Curtain, the Poles had one thing on their mind. We need to get the fuck out of Russia's sphere of influence. It makes sense since they'd suffered under Russian control for the last 200 years. As such, Poland immediately began the long and painful transition to a capitalist Western-oriented market economy, and their hard work was rewarded with them joining NATO in 1999 and the EU in 2004. While Poland experienced an incredible economic ascension in the past 30 years or so, they had to carefully maintain a balance between pursuing strong foreign relations and following their personal interests, resulting in some shaky relations with the EU that have since been more or less resolved. But you know, it would be nice if Germany paid some reparations. In the meantime, out of the ashes of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation has also undergone a lengthy process of reconstruction and partial democratization. There were even some optimistic prospects of the Russians looking for and obtaining NATO membership, and despite the Federation ultimately choosing the imperialist route, instead of allying with the rest of Europe, both Russia and Poland actually tried to patch things up with each other on some occasions. After all, they're both strong, conservative Christian countries who prefer holding on to tradition and sovereignty over following someone else's whim. So, in another timeline, you could see a happy ending with a friendly united front between the Poles and Russians. Keyword: could. However, efforts of restoring Polish-Russian bilateral relations have been ground to a halt once the Kremlin went back to doing classic Kremlin things, pressuring European countries into signing shady energy deals, sowing the seeds of distrust and skepticism, and allegedly interfering with democratic elections across the globe, undermining the sovereignty of neighboring nations to satiate their thirst for imperialism, tactics all too familiar to the Poles. Not only that, but Russian officials have begun flipping the World War II invasion narrative over its head, with the chairman of the Russian State Duma himself, Vyacheslav Volodin, demanding Poland to pay Moscow $750 billion for the kind and selfless act of liberating it from the Nazis. However, the greatest sin committed by Russian hands has to be corrupting Poland's greatest historical ally and BFF, Hungary, into becoming the confrontational, contrarian, and bitchy country they are today. This is why Poland has been intensively bracing itself for yet another armed conflict against the Russians, something yet missing in the 21st century. Whether by unconditionally aiding and supporting Ukraine in their war with Russia, increasing their military spending, or pushing for new energy and industry deals meant to loosen the Kremlin's grip over Europe, Poland has shown their determination and desire to end this blood feud once and for all. In the eyes of the Poles, Russia has historically been a rival nation that in the latter years got the best of them and continuously attempted to erase their language, culture, and general heritage in an attempt to build a greater unified Slavic superstate. While in more recent times, since the establishment of the Iron Curtain, they severely infringed their sovereignty and the right to self-determination. Hence, the Poles and Polish state look at Russia and their people with grave skepticism and distrust. To many Poles, Russia is an enemy state which had a habit of invading and suppressing them, and although history doesn't repeat, Poland definitely thinks it rhymes. The Russians, on the other hand, view Poland as a traitorous state. In the eyes of many, Slavs are one people and should be unified under the same state, with Russia being the ringleader. To them, Poles and Poland are apostates who, with every opportunity, sided with the Western powers, who they see as imperialists and a detriment to the Slavs, whilst also believing that they, the Russians, are solely to thank for liberating them from the evil clutches of fascism, and instead of thanking them for the mass sacrifice millions of Soviet men made to liberate them from the Nazis, the Poles turned against them. Today, the relations between the two can be described as extremely icy and antagonistic, with each waiting with anticipation what the other will do to harm them. Although many older Russians have an antagonistic view of Poland, the younger generation, however, has a more positive outlook on the country, as Poland has been the poster child of economic development in Eastern Europe and has become extremely influential in pop culture with its export of video games and memes. Much of Russia's younger generation has become quite fond of the country and its culture. As of the current geopolitical climate, it is uncertain whether the two will make amends anytime soon. Who knows if these two nations will be able to patch up things in the near future and coexist in peace and harmony. Maybe in a couple of generations and Witcher sequels, things might make a turn for the better. Crazier things have certainly happened before. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like and smash that subscribe button, and if you really did, become a member like these wonderful people. My name is Janos, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey, why are you leaving?